Hi, everybody. Welcome to all of you who have logged in to this conversation tonight, which is a conversation in honor of a most interesting problem, what Darwin's Descent of Man got right and wrong about human evolution. And that's a book edited by Jeremy DeSilva. The book is a collective close reading, a tribute, as well as a critique, all in one. And so I'm so pleased that Jeremy, as well as two of his fellow contributors to the book, Holly Dunsworth and Augustine Fuentes, can be with us tonight to assess what then, in light of the scientific record of 150 years since the publication of The Descent of Man, what Darwin did and didn't get right in that book. So I'm going to introduce our guests who are waiting off screen very briefly and then step aside, but want to begin quickly by thanking Princeton University's Anthropology Department, our co-sponsors tonight, for their help in getting word out. And also quickly, just a couple practical notes. A most interesting problem is published by our friends at the exceptional Princeton University Press. And unsurprisingly, it's a really beautifully produced book. I wish I could be putting it in your hands so you can see for yourself. But at any rate, if you would like to buy a copy of that book from Labyrinth, I want to point out that there's a long green screen at the bottom of your button. That's a link for ordering that online from Labyrinth. And you will get 10% off on your entire order if you just enter DeSilva at checkout. So if you prefer to order by phone or email, I've put the information for all of that in the chat. And so you can do it that way too. We hope that you won't be shy about asking questions. And to do that, to ask a question, you will need to click on the Ask a Question button, if you want to just find that also at the bottom of your screen quickly, instead of using the chat. So the questions have to go down there. And if you could enter those as they come to you, that would actually be helpful to us, because seeing the questions as they come in kind of helps us know how to time the Q&A. So just feel free to cue those up. But now, tonight's speakers. Jeremy DeSilva is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. And from 1998 to 2003, he worked as an educator at the Boston Museum of Science, which I mention because he continues to be passionate about science education, and that is really evident in the book he has now edited. A Most Interesting Problem brings together experts who know how to write for a really broad public, which is not at all always the case. Jeremy's book, First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human, will be out in just a month or two. So we're looking forward to that also. Holly Dunsworth is a biological anthropologist at the University of Rhode Island, and she is particularly interested in how we narrate evolutionary history and in how our narratives, mistakes and all, impact culture and society. Her many published essays and articles have titles like What Trump Got Wrong About Evolution, or Thank Your Intelligent Mother for Your Big Brain. And they make you want to look them all up straight away. I suggest that you do that after the event. So then, last but not least at all, Augustine Fuentes is professor at anthropology at Princeton University. And his projects include exploring cooperation, creativity, and belief in human evolution, multi-species anthropologies, evolutionary theory, and as I think will become clear tonight, also engaging race and racism. Fuentes is an active public scientist. I think you'll see that's the common denominator here, with many honors to his name, and he's also an explorer for National Geographic. I will mention just a couple of his acclaimed books, namely Why We Believe Evolution and the Human Way of Being, Why We Believe, subtitled Evolution and the Human Way of Being, The Creative Spark, How Imagination Makes Humans Exceptional, and then Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Nature. I think there may well be some myth and prejudice busting going on tonight, and so here now, I am going to bring up our guests. I'm delighted to have them here. There is Jeremy DeSilva, welcome. And now here, Augustín Fuentes and Holly Dunsworth. Welcome to all of you. I'm just so happy that you're here and look forward to listening in. Take it away.
Thank you, Dorothea. I really appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to speak about our book, A Most Interesting Problem, What Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. This is the 150th anniversary of Darwin's publication of Descent of Man. He wrote it and published it in 1871. And it's an opportunity in our field to reflect on 150 years of testing his ideas and assessing the things that he wrote that are supported with evidence, and the things that he wrote that are not, and need to be changed as a result. Two of the contributors to the book are here with us this evening, Augustín Fuentes and Holly Dunsworth, who wrote two pivotal chapters in the book that are some of the most important ones, I think, that not only in the book, but important chapters or pieces of writing that have been written on these topics this decade. A really important scholarship that's done and communicated in a way to a broader audience that folks can understand, as you'll hear more tonight. I am a paleoanthropologist. I study the human fossil record. Unfortunately, we had a great paleoanthropologist also contributing to this book, Johannes Haile Selassie. I want to call attention to the other authors here as well. We had an amazing historian, Janet Brown, write the introduction, a science journalist, an award-winning science journalist, Ann Gibbons, wrote the last chapter in the book, sort of bringing it all together from a bird's eye view as only she could. We also have chapters by Alice Roberts, Susanna Herculano-Huzel, Brian Hare, Christina Kilgrove, John Hawkes, and Mike Ryan. Mike Ryan had the challenging task of taking all of sexual selection, a whole part of Darwin's book, chapters and chapters, and squishing it into a single chapter that he did absolutely beautifully. And so you'll get a piece of that tonight. But please check out the book to read the other contributors as well. I also want to thank Alison Collette, who was our editor at Princeton University Press and did a really remarkable job working with all of us, sort of a herding cats, as you do with academics. But we came together and got this in on time. So 150 years after Darwin writes Descent of Man, again, as a field, we get a chance to reflect on what he got right, what he got wrong. Remember, at the time, he didn't know anything about DNA, and the human fossil record was essentially non-existent, although I'll return to that in just a second. And yet what Darwin wrote, in many ways, we still grapple with today and still think about today. There are dozens, there are literally hundreds of scientists who are addressing the kinds of questions that he was asking or beginning to ask in the 1850s, 60s, into the 1870s. And now we have a lot more tools and we have a lot more data that we can actually address some of these questions. Now, as a paleoanthropologist, I can look at what Darwin got right and what Darwin got wrong. Darwin was able to position humans within the family tree and make arguments that the same natural laws that affect birds and butterflies and bats are going to impact humans as well, that we evolved. His mechanism of evolution, natural selection, that he lays out in Origin of Species, he then applies to humans in Descent of Man. And not only that, but applies sexual selection as well, which is problematic, as you'll hear about in just a moment. Darwin, without the wealth of evidence we have today, was able to predict that humans are most closely related to the African great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas, while there were other scholars suggesting that humans had more distant relatives and were more closely related to the Asian apes, or not even related to any specific ape at all. And we know now with genetic evidence that Darwin was right, that we're not only related to the African apes, but to chimpanzees and bonobos in particular. And bonobos weren't even known to Western science at the time of Darwin's writing. They were first described in 1933, long after Darwin had died. Darwin predicted that the earliest human fossils would be found in Africa. And indeed, they are. Some of the earliest fossils that we have, going back 7 million years, thought to be members of the human lineage found on the African continent, as Darwin predicted. He also made some suggestions about what makes humans unique anatomically. He talked about bipedalism, walking on two legs, which is what I study. He talked about our tiny little fang teeth, our little canines. He argued that humans were the only technologically savvy primate making tools and using tools, and that we had large brains. And he saw these as interconnected. That those individuals that were moving on two legs could free their hands to carry tools and extract resources, meat resources from the environment, and that would have sustained an enlarged brain. But we know now that those four things didn't happen in concert. We've got a rich fossil record, literally thousands of fossils that we have now, that we can test some of these ideas. And we know now that human evolution unfolded in more of a mosaic pattern, where bipedalism long preceded brain enlargement. And we first really got an insight into that with the discovery of Lucy, the skeleton Lucy, who had a small ape-sized brain in a body that was adapted for bipedal locomotion. And so we often will say, you know, if only Darwin had access to the information, if only Darwin had the fossils. But in researching this book, one of the things that was amazing to me was that Darwin was brought an early human fossil in 1864. Hugh Falconer, who was a Scottish paleontologist, had in his possession what we now know as a Neanderthal skull from Gibraltar. And he brought it to Darwin when Darwin was staying with his sister-in-law in London in 1864. And what is remarkable to me as a paleontologist is how little effect this had on Darwin. Darwin wrote about it in a single line in a letter that he wrote to his friend Hooker, and said that it's a wonderful skull. He could describe it as a wonderful skull, but then he didn't write much about it at all. And so he literally had evidence for a human ancestry in his hands, and he didn't quite see it. And so with that, I want to read a little bit from the preface of the book, which I wrote, and then turn it over to Augustine. Science is done by scientists. Even the very best scientists in the world, in this case Charles Darwin himself, miss things. Sometimes these errors are rooted in bias. Sometimes they arise from insufficient data to answer the question being asked. And sometimes they happen because an illness compromises focus when a friend visits with an ancient fossil skull one summer day in 1864. Figuring out how the natural world works is not easy. Fossils do not come with labels. It took the discovery of many more fossils in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for scientists to recognize the legitimacy of Neanderthals. And even then, it wasn't until DNA was extracted from these old bones, quite recently, that we began to truly understand the role of Neanderthals in human evolution. And today, we still have many unanswered questions about our extinct cousins. The inner workings of the natural world do not magically reveal themselves. Data never speak for themselves. Instead, interpretations of evidence are made by people who breathe meaning into empirically derived facts and figures. And scientific hypotheses are not always self-evident. They are generated in creative minds and tested by emotional, subjective humans, primates, behaving as objectively as they can. Science is thus a human endeavor. Sometimes the humanity of science leads to great insights, but sometimes it leads to a scientist holding the evidence for a human past literally in his hands without recognizing it. And that is why science cannot be done in isolation by a single individual. It is a collective enterprise that unfolds over generations as we test and retest old ideas and develop new ones to make sense of our world. It stagnates when it is done by homogeneous scientists with similar backgrounds and experiences. And it outright fails when it is practiced by inflexible individuals clinging desperately to tired ideas. Darwin knew this. While many of us scientists admire Darwin, we do not worship him. He was a brilliant scholar who not only generated new data, but could see how his observations were connected under big overarching ideas, with both explanatory and predictive power. He navigated seamlessly between big picture theory level thinking and the small intricate details. In studying orchids, earthworms, and barnacles, and people, he could see both the forest and the trees. But Darwin had flaws, both as a scientist and as a human. So now I'd like to turn things over to Augustine Fuentes.
Thanks so much, Jerry, for that great overview and intro to the book. And again, thanks to Labyrinth Books for hosting this. And of course, thanks to Princeton University Press for, putting this book out there. We really appreciate it. And I encourage everyone watching us now to get a copy of this book and read all the chapters, because this ability that we have to take this really incredible work, Descent of Man, which was so powerful and today is still held up as sort of one of these great accomplishments in the sciences, and to reflect from our vantage point now on that point 150 years ago, not just on Darwin and what Darwin offered, but on how we understand the science and how we understand the way in which knowledge is created and disseminated and translated into the world. So I was honored, really, and humbled to be asked to revisit Charles Darwin's Chapter 7 of Descent of Man, which he titled On the Races of Man. I have to just sort of preface this by saying that Darwin, as we've already laid out here, was an amazing scientist. I mean, he was meticulous as an analyst. He was ridiculously complete in his treatment of the details of most of what he worked on. He spent 6 years writing a multi-volume version of fossil barnacles. That's very impressive. And reading his work, one sees that. So that's why rereading, and I had read this in college and a little bit in grad school, rereading Descent of Man in its entirety, but specifically the chapter I was working on, The Races of Man, sort of like a gut punch. It's powerfully wrong. And when I say this, what I'm saying is that Darwin, as I'll show you in a moment, actually lays out a great critique of the entire concept of biological race in humans, but he can't see it. He can't see his own scientific capacity right there in front of him because he is blinded by his investment in a racist ideology and a racist perspective of what the world looks like. And I want to push here against some people who say, no, Darwin was a good person. I agree with that. I think he's enriched my life, all of our lives in many ways. But he also held onto notions that were common during his day and remain common today. He held onto those notions, but he actually produced and engaged data that refuted them right in front of him, and he couldn't see that. So like being handed that skull of the Neanderthal, he just didn't care. And that's actually the powerful thing. And I think that's very important. So what's my point here? What am I trying to get across? Darwin is an incredible scientist. So in The Races of Man, what Darwin ends up sort of sets out to do is to, and I'll read his opening premise here. He says, "It is not my intention here to describe the several so-called races of men, but to inquire what is the value of the differences between them under a classificatory point of view and how they have originated." So what Darwin's really saying here is that, yep, biological races exist. Humans are divided up into black, white, so African, European, indigenous Americans, Asia, and a few other clusters. So that's what he's saying. Now, what's really interesting is that he takes the first part of this chapter to demonstrate that all humans belong to the same species. Because during his time, there was this argument that of monogenism versus polygenism, that these different races actually came from different branches of potential humanity. And Darwin clearly, and he wipes that off the table. He masters the evidence that he had available to him and says, nope, all humans are the same species. Here's all the data. Here it's very clear. And he demonstrates that well. Then he goes on to point out how different the races are, especially those of African descent. He comes back again and again in all of his discussions of difference to single out, to isolate peoples from sub-Saharan Africa. And he does this intentionally. In his treatments, he points out to us that humans vary, right? He says, there is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared and measured, differ much from each other as in the texture of hair, the relative proportions of all the parts of the body, the capacity of the lungs, the form, the capacity of the skull, and even the convolutions of the brain. The races differ also in constitution, in acclimatization, and in liability to certain diseases. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct, chiefly as would appear in their emotional, but partially also in their intellectual faculties. And he goes on to say, even the most distinct races of man, with the exception of certain, and I apologize for this term, but certain Negro tribes are much more like each other in form than one would first be supposed. So Darwin actually spent some time showing a bunch of diversity and differences, then says, but you know what, actually, humans are all really, really pretty much the same, except for sub-Saharan Africans. And he does this again and again and again. Now, what's very interesting and what's fascinating, and a really a tribute to Darwin's science, is that throughout this chapter, he reviews the sort of diversity that he's read about or seen. And he keeps coming back to the point of saying, however, if we look at the races of man distributed over the world, we must infer that their characteristic differences cannot be accounted for by the direct action of different conditions of life, even after exposure to them for an enormous period of time. And he goes on to demonstrate quite clearly that he cannot demonstrate or support natural selection as acting on dividing humans into different races. In spite of saying that, he comes back at the end to say, well, the races are different, and in fact, they're different intellectually, and it turns out that some races are better than others. And of course, we know those races happen to be white folks, in particular, the British. And Darwin makes a number of these comparisons, and in one of the most damaging, I think, components or parts of this chapter, he then goes on to argue and provide evidence of incredible genocide, of the introduction of epidemics and the mass slaughter and rape of indigenous peoples around the world, and argues that that's basically akin to natural selection, that when two races show up together, the sort of better fit race will win out. So why bring all of this up? It's actually really important for two reasons. One, I already said, he actually marshals the evidence to refute the idea of biological race in this chapter, but he can't see it because of his own bias. The second one is how deep his own bias was, because in this chapter, and if you read his letters, and especially his notes about the voyage of the Beagle, he's really clear when he interacts with indigenous Americans, for example, from Tierra del Fuego in southern Chile, or when he, as a young man in Edinburgh, right, going to university there, he is taught by a man named John Edmonstone, right, South American of African descent, who's in Edinburgh. So a black man is teaching Darwin. Darwin seeks him out to learn about taxidermy and about the animals and the ecologies of South America, and spends months with him and has nothing but nice things to say about him. And he says this about the Fuegians and about other indigenous peoples that he's interacted with. And yet, when it comes to put on the dominant mantle of science and to pronounce what he really believes and concludes in the book, he falls back on simplistic, racist, and erroneous tropes. And he represents an incredible bias towards peoples from sub-Saharan Africa and a favoritism of European groups over all other groups as nature. So that's damaging and depressing. The good thing that one can take from this chapter is that if you read it carefully, you see the science. You see the scientist in action. You see him comparing and recognizing and clearly identifying what he can and cannot say. And then the bad part, the ugly part, is that he just wipes all that off the table and comes down as a well-off British gentleman telling you what race is better. And the damage is that even through today, those beliefs are still in play. In fact, the terms he used, and this chapter is cited by white supremacists and racists in support of their argument. So his argument today is almost exactly the same as is made by those who marched in Charlotte and by those who are constantly espousing white supremacy. That's damaging, and that has to be corrected. And so that's, what I tried to do in this chapter is to point out the good, right, which is the science and the possibility and the hope, but also the bad and the ugly, because it's with us right now. And there are many, many, many people who are still espousing this racist garbage and trying to draw on Darwin and other scientists who are erroneously and mistakenly putting forward these ideas. That's all I got. Holly?
Okay. My chapter, carries forward a lot of what Augustine was so elegantly explaining about his work in his chapter, and what Darwin was grappling with in Descent of Man. So this is where chapters 19 and 20, these are the chapters I responded to. And this is where Darwin was looking at geographic variation in human biology, the visible kind mostly, and variation, differences between the sexes, and applying applying sexual selection, not natural selection, but sexual selection, to explain this, to explain all kinds of human variation. And so it was also hard for me to do this reading because I had read Descent of Man before I worked on this book with you all, but I had not read the parts that were particular to human variation. I had read about the fossils and primates and all of the wonderful things about the wonderful emotional intelligence of baboons. And I had read the sexual selection parts, of course, because that's the intellectual fertile ground. And that's what it's known for. And it's not, why would I read these outdated ideas about human evolution? They're not going to advance my understanding of human evolution. They're not part of the current conversation. They're a historical artifact. Plus, if you crack open the page and you see savages all over the place, or worse, monstrous savages all over the place, you just think, I don't need that. That's not the foundational part. But I'm glad, even though it makes me shake still, just to talk about it now. I'm really glad I had this opportunity to closely read the parts I had been avoiding, because I was able to see, like Augustine and Jerry have said, the legacy, the incredible, powerful legacy, not just of the incredible scientific contribution Charles Darwin has made, but of the myths, the harmful myths he helped to not just, launch, because he was part of his zeitgeist at the time, but to really, there's such powerful myths that they're still here with us today. And none of us have had the strength or the wherewithal to change them yet. And so reading this was enlightening, enraging. I had to work through some very, very personal issues with some people I love who I disagree with politically. And also, while there were people marching for, racist reasons, like in Charlottesville, and who also I know espouse very sexist and misogynistic views at the same time. And a lot of this, if you spend a lot of time online or you hear about it from your students, is very evolution based. They love to think that nature, and not just like the nature from religion, but nature from Darwin and nature from evolution and biology is behind the real truth about human variation and what it is and that it exists. And so it's a very intense time to be reading these pages from Darwin, given how relevant they are. And it galvanized me and made me see more clearly, hopefully, how I can contribute to something good and something positive. Even though, boy, because I've told Jerry over and over, there was a lot of rage sweat that went into this chapter. I think Jerry saw some of it that got cut out before it made it into the book. So if I have time, I thought, because I've never done a reading, I just really would love to read straight out of the book a little bit from the introduction, and then maybe it will spark some questions from you all who are with us tonight, and then we can have a further conversation that way. Okay, so my chapter is called This View of Wife, and it starts with the quote from Darwin that he says, "Man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius." Okay, so it starts, "At a glance, chapters 19 and 20 of Descent of Man look like Victorian age appropriate evolutionary explanations for skin and hair differences between the sexes and among peoples across the globe, and for how our naked, colorful skin developed out of our ape ancestry. But underneath Darwin's ambitious scientific contribution lies much more than surface beauty. This is Darwin begetting every caveman-inspired nugget of dating advice, every best-selling author's stance on innate gender roles, and every entertainer's sexist appeal to science. This is where Darwin first turned his concept of sexual selection loose on humans, launching the evolutionary narrative starring, quote, the strongest and boldest men in contests for wives that dominates popular culture. In Descent, Darwin parlayed visible anatomical differences between the sexes, like those in skin color, hair patterns, and height, into the evolutionary logic, those are scare quotes, behind why man and wife perform differently in matters of love, sex, parenting, cognitive feats, and seemingly everything else according to the contemporary worldviews he continues to shape. But pop culture has been slow to adopt new knowledge that has complicated and overturned old facts. Many of the novel insights on human evolution have come from women, despite persistent beliefs like Darwin's that, quote, with woman, the powers of intuition, of rapid perception, and perhaps of imitation are more strongly marked than in man, but some, at least, of these faculties are characteristic of the lower races and therefore of a past and lower state of civilization, end quote. In Descent, Darwin even concludes, as if by scientific logic, that, quote, man has ultimately become superior to woman. For Darwin, women were wives, but men were so much more than husbands, an assumption seeding his science of sex differences. From his view of life, Darwin penned nature's seal of approval. It was a lot of fun, actually, now that I'm back into the pages, thinking about how I got to cite and quote so many of my good friends in this chapter. My good friend Cynthia Taylor, Heather Norton, Ellen Quillen. I got to quote and cite my old mentor from my postdoc days, Nina Jablonski. There's just, there's a fabulous quote from Wednesday Martin. It's a little R-rated, so be careful. There's just, it was a lot of fun writing. The choices I made were to, well, the theme was, since I had to deal with men are superior, women are inferior, you know, I decided to write, the theme was listen to women, so without saying so. So it's a tour of all these wonderful contributions to the science and to the context and to thinking about the way we do science, the critique from a lot of brilliant women.
Holly, I love the title. It's just so it captures, no, but it's such an important component that captures that. And I guess I didn't mention about mine too. I do like we were all asked to do, which is update the chapter. So the end part of mine is the updating the chapter. And actually, I just noticed in the Q&A here, there's actually a cluster of questions that relate to from mine. Yours are probably coming up right now. I want to just run through these and answer them really quickly because there's a bunch that are easy, and there's one, Jerry, for you too.
I don't see any questions, but
okay. You have to hover over the
bottom.
Yeah,
and it says ask a question.
Anyway, let me run through these race ones really quickly. so
Great.
that people can ask them. So thank you all for asking these questions. First one on race here very quickly is, if Darwin was a racist, was Wallace? Yes. And in fact, Wallace wrote a paper that Darwin called the best application ever of natural selection, where Wallace explicitly argues for a very hierarchy, a ranking of races, and an ultimate likelihood supporting Darwin's initial notion of the extinction of races. So it's too bad, because Wallace is really one of my biggest heroes, because he's an incredible ecologist, and he set the bar for a natural history engagement. And as Darwin, one of my big heroes, but seeing them in this context, I think, is very important. And just very quickly, another one, what contributed to, is the ultimate conclusion that there is no such thing as races? I go over that very much in the essay, and many people have demonstrated this. There's no such thing as biological races in contemporary humans. So Homo sapiens sapiens does not have any divisions by biological clusterings that we could call races. However, race, black, white, Asian, indigenous American, or African, European, whatever you want to call these and how these are used, these are constructed political, social, and economic realities. They are experiences. In the United States, it matters when you walk down the street if you're black, white, or Asian, right? Because it's real. It's just not biological. And that's, I think, one of the most important things to highlight. And we can talk more about that later. Just a couple other that are interesting here. What contributed to Darwin's blind spot and his racist assessment? Give us some feeling that if he had written all races were equal, that would have been political, social. What would have the political, social, and academic response? He would never have written all races are equal. What I argue in the chapter is that if Darwin was around today, he would, because of the just mind-blowing, overwhelming data, right, and analyses, he would say, oh, well, there aren't any biological races in contemporary humans. So that's off the table. There's some other things going on. So it's not that he would say all races are equal. It's that race is not a biological concept. So basically, he has nothing to say about it, right? Race is a social, cultural, and political reality, and racism is the problem, not race. And so I think those are very important. And I think there was one more race one. Darwin's bias in upper class white British gentlemen, was there also bias in from him being a Christian, i.e. and the idea was man was made in God's image? Well, there's a lot to be said there, and the sort of colonial moment created, right? This sort of colonial expansion of white Christianity has a huge role to play in sort of these divisions and contexts. But I would encourage whoever asked the question also to think about this in regard to Holly's context. We even reinterpret the, Christian notions, right? In Genesis, there are two versions of Genesis. There's the big, long beginning of Genesis, where God creates men and women in his image. So, and his is not male gendered. It is men and women are both in the image of God. And then the very end of Genesis, there's this tacked on bit where there's the story about, for some reason, they've already explained creation, but now they're going to say, no, he put Adam to sleep and pulled the rib out. Most people in contemporary reality think only the rib story, but in fact, the vast majority of Genesis has this equal representation of man and women in God's image. So that's very interesting, different interpretations.
I showed up at college in osteology class expecting there to be fewer ribs in men than women, because I thought that's what that story was about. And then, have you read that fun paper, that historical philosophy paper that suggests it's actually a story about the loss of the human penis bone?
The baculum, yeah. It's rod rather than rib, right? Yeah.
It's, something about, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, what else here?
So you were asked, Augustine, what does it mean that it's not biological about races? So unpack that a little bit.
This is actually an important one to talk about race and sex and a variety of things. So when I say race is not biological, it means that there is no biological characteristic or process, evolutionary process or biological pattern that differentiates these clusters that we call white, black, Asian, African, European, Asian, indigenous, what have you. Okay, so there's no gene, there's no genetic sequences, there's no biological developmental processes, there's not a single biological pattern that distinctively and continuously distinguishes black from white from Asian, right? And this is a much longer conversation, but the data are out there. Many people have published this. It's very, very clear. So race does not come from biology. That doesn't mean it's not real and it's not part of who we are. It just, humans are not divided biologically by races. We're divided historically, politically, economically, socially, and culturally by races.
So where I see students hung up on this a lot is when we talk about skin coloration being biological and having a biological basis, the concentration of melanin that you have in your skin, and then saying that but race is not biological. Right. So that might be what the question is asking.
But that's a great example. So skin color is not a definitional characteristic of any of those categories. What do I mean by that? Well, dark skin, right, which actually most humans on the planet, there are almost 8 billion humans, right? The vast majority of them have what would be considered in the United States dark skin. Anyways, dark skin is found, and Holly already acknowledged Nina Jablonski's incredible work in this area. Dark skin is found in indigenous populations and populations circumequatorially on the entire planet. Dark skin is not a characteristic of sub-Saharan African populations any more than it is a characteristic of Southeast Asian populations, Australasian populations, Melanesian populations. So dark skin doesn't divide people up into races. Neither does light skin, right? We just in the United States have this perspective where we only see a limited amount of that distribution. So I think that's a really good example. It's just none of these characteristics define it. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just rattling on.
One of the difficulties, I think, is just as simple as this. In America, in the US, we have made race, the word race, synonymous with biological variation. Right. And so when somebody will be referring to, for example, skin color variation in a popular sense, but they'll say race. Right. They'll say, but that's not race. And so if we can call race what it is, race is always about categorizing people into a hierarchical system, or you could say it's a system of oppression, a system of inequity, a political system, rather than a word you want to use as synonymous for like blood type variation around the world. That's not race. And so if you can reconceptualize what race is and what it isn't, then it's easier to see how it could be a cultural and social construct as opposed to a biological reality, even though the biological variation is what cues us into labeling people. That's one way that can help tease that issue apart.
But that's exactly it, right? If it has to do with biology and you're using race, stop. You're wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, right. I mean, that's it. And Darwin points that out in chapter 7. He says that little bit I read to you. He says, I can't explain any of this variation via natural selection. So maybe it's sexual selection, or that must be it. And he clearly saw that this pattern of biological variation in humans does not map to the races. And yet he couldn't bring himself to overcome his sort of inherent discriminatory biases and beliefs.
Yeah.
Is there another one?
So there's a question. How did Darwin conclude that humans started out in Africa? So I can dive into that one. So in Descent of Man, there's this remarkable page. It's page 199, where it has all these incredible gems, just gem after gem. It's like he jumped in a time machine and had a moment where he was able to, spend 5 minutes with a biological anthropology textbook, and before he had to go back. Right? It's incredible. So I love this one page, and on it, he talks about, okay, well, who are humans closely related to? We're primates. We're obviously primates, but who are we related to? And even in 1868, he draws a primate family tree in his notebooks. He sketches a family tree, and he has humans as equally related to the African and Asian apes. He doesn't know. But 3 years later, 1871, he writes, it is probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee. These two species are now man's nearest allies. Okay, so he now reconfigures the tree where humans are related to the African apes. And then he goes on to say, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. And he draws that inference from his previous statement that humans are related to chimpanzees and gorillas, and therefore the common ancestor was likely to be something that lived also in Africa, as our close living relatives do. But he had no genetic evidence to know that, to test that. Huxley was a fan of this argument on the basis of anatomical dissections and brain morphology, and so I think he was heavily influenced by that. But it's interesting because he then goes on to say, but it is useless to speculate on this, because he knows he doesn't have the data. He doesn't have the fossils. He doesn't have the genetics. So he does eventually say it's useless to speculate. We now know that he was right, but the field definitely shifted to an Asian and even a European sort of centric attitude. Haeckel thought that humans were more closely related to the Asian apes. Eugene Dubois was influenced by that and went and found the earliest Homo erectus fossils on the island of Java. So some of the earliest pre-Homo neanderthalensis, pre-Homo sapiens fossils were found in Asia. And so there was a thought at that time that maybe humans descended from Asia. And then of course Piltdown shifted the attention back to Europe before wonderful Taungchild refocused our attention where it should be, which is Africa, which was Darwin's starting point.
So it's so interesting that he hedged his bets in that context, and then when it came to comparing races, he didn't. He just went way beyond what was right in his eyes to do that. And one of the questions here even says, how come Darwin could stand up to the scientific community? And I think in arguing for natural selection and those kinds of things, but not the social community. And I would say that the question is problematic because the scientific community was actually the main community driving the racist ideology. The social community was much more dynamic. There was a lot of philosophers, social theorists, abolitionists, and others arguing for the reconfiguration of the idea of racism. And I should also note, Darwin was in support, as his family, particularly his wife's family, of abolition. He was very much against the enslavement of peoples. But that didn't stop him from being racist and thinking of a racial hierarchy of human groups. So that's actually very interesting as a case study, right? His biases. And Holly, in your overview, I mean, when you drew out some of those things, when I was reading it again, I went back and looked, and I'm like, was it that? And it's just his relationship. When we found out and we've seen, right, his daughter and his wife helped him write a lot of this. They actually did a lot of critique and editing, copy editing for him. And so obviously he had great respect for them, just like he did for people of other races that he sort of saw and got on with, and yet it didn't come out in the pages.
Yeah. It's remarkable. It's funny, I've been thinking a lot about this. Last time we got together, Ann Gibbons, who wrote that remarkable last chapter, Dinner with Darwin, and she consulted a lot of human evolution heavyweights and luminaries and wonderful thinkers, and they had lots of interesting things to say to Darwin at dinner. And we had this conversation together. What would we say? And I was completely flummoxed by the question, because there's a couple reasons. The things I wrote in my chapter are nowhere near anything I've ever said at dinner. And not with the person at the dinner table that I'd like to say them to. And if these ideas did come to mind at dinner, we talked about sports. So like this is, I'm thinking of his family. I'm thinking of, he's writing that women are inferior, men are superior, and it's nature, right? We evolved that way. It's science. This is, it's really hard for me to put that in a context of a hypothetical dinner party. Like, what would you say to this man? Because it's beyond dinner conversation. It's so beyond. It's so far beyond that. It's hard to put in words.
And that, I think, is what Jerry said in the beginning, reading from that excellent his introduction to the book. This idea that diverse research teams, right, that inclusive scholarship. There's a reason why that counts, right? We all have our biases of different kinds of structures. Yes. I mean, Darwin should have he did collaborate with his wife and daughter, helped him a lot. And yet and who knows what that changed? I don't know. And I haven't found any really good treatment of what really changed through that. But I bet you it was aided in his broader context. So we do better work when we work with folks who are different from us, who have different experiences.
That's right.
That bring a different lens to it. And that was one of the big problems that Darwin had, was that he was very isolated in his head and in a very small circle of the sort of the Royal Society and his sort of peers. And we know, for example, that there were some incredible women engaging in that group. I think it was Lyell's secretary, who unfortunately I'm forgetting her name right now, wrote some amazing work on evolutionary theory and corresponded with Darwin. And we know that Darwin corresponded with a number of different women scientists and philosophers and really incredible thinkers. But did he incorporate any of that? And I would like to say probably not. And that hurt the quality of the work. And it hurts us all not to be more open to more diverse perspectives.
Yeah. I guess the thing we could say too is you can't expect one person to do it all, right? To revolutionize everything. and if they're going to be revolutionary, and then you expect them to be revolutionary about like fitting in their society and making sense of themselves and those around them, that's asking a lot more, I think, than of someone to explain how evolution works. So maybe this is one of the lessons, one of the profound lessons from this project. Yeah.
I mean,
to me, it's what makes the hero worshiping of some of these scientific giants a problem. That look, I deeply admire Darwin. I went to Down House. I walked the thinking path. I had chills going down my spine, thinking that I was walking the same footsteps that he was walking in, and holding rocks that may have been polished by his shoes, and just right. And going into his study, and can I through osmosis somehow absorb some of this brilliance, right?
Yes.
And yet, some of you've heard, Holly, I think more than I have, some pushback on your chapter about folks that engage with Darwin hero worship, that everything he said must have been right and must have been perfect, when of course not. No,
Yeah.
And we should take him to task for what he was wrong about, and he would expect that of us.
Yes.
As a good scientist, he would expect that of us.
Yes. Yeah. I quoted him. It was adorable. About false views and taking pleasure in falsifying them. It's not just the hero worship, though. I think it is that there are some frameworks, scientific frameworks, that require some of his assumptions, his weak or wrong assumptions, to be correct. And they are still out there, operating as scientists. And they don't want to have to face the fundamental assumptions undergirding their science, I think. Instead they say, I'm ridiculous. I'm ridiculous.
Well, I mean, but this is this whole, when people want to attack, I mean, that's the one thing. Who cares if 7 out of 10 scientists prefer brand X? I don't care. What do the data and the analytics say? I'm a scientist, right? I want people to listen to me, but I don't want them to agree with me because of who I am. I want them to recognize the research, the analysis, and the way in which that's laid out and presented. That's what we can accomplish, right? And I do agree. I think Darwin would agree with that. In essence, that's the whole point of this process of knowledge production we call science. So, and it's not perfect. It's got tons of flaws, and humans do that. In fact, that first question that was on the thing is, could AI tech remove the emotion and subjectivity of scientific inquiry? And the answer is no, because humans build AI, right? We know algorithms, our whole reliance on AI is causing real problems, particularly in regards to racism and sexism, because much of the AI is designed by a very small category of the diversity of humankind. And those algorithms are, causing issues because of that lack of diversity and experience.
And I'll just note, a whole blanket case against emotion might be too much. Emotional intelligence is probably pretty valuable in a lot of areas of science. So to have an emotionless science would be an incomplete science, I would say. You wouldn't be doing all the things science could do.
No way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think Darwin would agree, since he values emotional intelligence so much.
Yeah. So there's a great question here. What if anything does Darwin say about consciousness? So one of the things that really struck me when I was reading Descent again, with this project in mind, was chapter 1, which Alice Roberts does an incredible job of updating the comparative anatomical and embryological evidence that humans evolved. So chapter 1, what does Darwin do? He lays out the evidence that humans have a past, that we have changed, and he does it through vestigial features, and he does it through embryology, and he does it through comparative anatomy. No genetics, no fossils, right? Which is what when we're teaching intro to biological anthropology, we very heavily rely on genetics and fossils now, the two things Darwin didn't really have. But then amazing to me is what he does next in chapters 2 and 3. He shifts immediately to the brain, and to prosociality, and to morality, and to consciousness, and to things that I would have thought that you leave that to the end. Like, that's going to be tough to explain, the brain, right? The human brain is this magnificent organ, and maybe you build up to that. But no, he tackles it right away in chapters 2 and 3. So Tony, a colleague, asked the question, check out Susanna Herculano's chapter 2, which is just this masterpiece of reassessing Darwin in light of today's neurobiological evidence. And what she essentially concludes is that he was right in saying that the human brain and all the things that come with it are different from other animals only in extent, not in kind. That we are so similar that we essentially just have a modified primate brain, which is a modified mammal brain.
And this is where he lost Wallace.
And that's where you lost Wallace. Exactly.
Wallace was like, can't do it. Humans are different in their intelligence and cognition and mind. I disagree. And so Wallace drew the line, which was my depression, because Wallace was always my hero for this naturalist and this kind of methodological rigor he has, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't apply his own insights and Darwin's insights to the human mind.
Yep. Dorothea's back.
Yeah, I just hopped back on. I'm just riveted by this conversation, and I'm finding myself sitting here remembering that you're all teachers and wondering about the fact that, on the one hand, how do we teach against this willful blindness that is prejudice that you have been describing, and is maybe imagination the antidote, imagination being the ability to see what's not yet in evidence. So if prejudice is the blindness to what's in front of you, and certainly that includes the record on women, because there were smart women all around Darwin, then is imagination the antidote? And how do you teach away from one, and how do you teach the other?
That's a great question. In fact, I'm very interested in that. I've written a lot on that. This whole idea of the human capacity to look at the world, to see what is or what we think is, to imagine something wholly new and to try to make that a reality. That's just this incredible part of humanity. And I think in teaching, providing students, providing colleagues, providing our friends and family with access to the range of actual knowledge, not just the limited teeny chunks that most of them think reality is. And I think, so that's one of the tricks of teaching, is like, feed the imagination, let people work together to think, give them the information. I've found people love knowledge. You just have to figure out how to engage them and to draw them in and make them co-constructors, participants in that knowledge. Don't just lecture at them. And I think providing access, for me, is at least one of the first steps to that next set, right? And hope, providing hope too. I mean, hope is a great capacity we have. I don't know where I'd be without it right now, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, so much more to think about. I'm going to be taking a lot of questions with me from this conversation, and clearly also, you know, the work of dislodging the kind of prejudice that you have been reflecting on is just momentous today, and you have added to the toolkit, right, with the chapters in this book. So a sincere thanks to all of you, a warm thanks for your time, for your thoughtfulness, and thank you all who are logged on for joining us. We hope that that you will pick up the book and continue the conversation as readers with each other and with the book. And there it is. Yeah, great. I'm glad you're holding it up. People should see the object. Let's have another coffee. Excellent. Good. Yeah. So this has been really fun and great. Many, many thanks. And I'm going to just close by wishing everyone a good evening and good health.
Thank you. You too, Dorothy.
Thanks so much. Stay safe and be well, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.